Good evening. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandora in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Pauline in Chicagoland, Karen in Northern California, Bill in mid-Missouri, and Edward says shalom from Texas, Melissa in Great Neck, Bell in Texas, Guy in Ohio, Jonathan in L.A., Elvis in New York, Peggy in Colorado, Bella in Florida, Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Ella says shalom, Aoife in Florida, Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. And they're really, how did Ed Sullivan used to say it? We've got a really big duff today. Ed Sullivan was way before even my time. But anyway, another big duff. Are we going to talk about the Sotah, the suspected adulteress? Not so much. Our extended digression from, we're in Sotah, Tractate Sotah, the laws of the suspected adulteress, when she received the warning and swore the oath when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. That did not have to be spoken in Lashon Kodesh, in the sacred tongue of Hebrew, but other matters did have to be spoken in Hebrew, like the ritual of the Egla Arufa, the heifer whose neck is broken. And that brought us to where we are in chapter 9, talking about that ritual. And we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 4. But here we got to, okay, so if the killer was found, right, so this is when a body was found, the victim of a murder, lying out in a field somewhere. And so elders from the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem would come and personally measure, okay, what's the nearest town that has a rabbinic court in it? And then the elders of that town would come and they would have to recite, that we did not kill this man, meaning that they took care of his needs. They didn't neglect him, send him on his way without accompaniment, or send him on his way without food. And that would have to be recited in Hebrew. So that's how this digression began. But then we got into a digression on a digression, because that ritual, the ritual of the Egla Arufa, the heifer whose neck was broken, which is mandated in the Torah, at a certain point the sages said we're not going to do that anymore. Why? Because we only do that ritual when the corpse is a victim of an unknown murderer. But as the spiritual level of the people in the land of Israel sank, there were more murderers in the land, more criminals in the land. And so at a certain point, it was thought, well, we found a murder victim. We don't know who killed him, but somebody must. And if anybody knows who killed the victim, then it is inappropriate to do that ritual. So now the sages have gone in this long kind of passage of describing how that spiritual level of the Jews in the Holy Land over time descended. We know that it did, right? The first temple was magnificent, Solomon's temple, and the spiritual level of the people was so high in the times of King David and King Solomon. King Solomon's son was a disaster as a king. The kingdom split in two. Idolatry started to come back and unfortunately be promoted by the kings, not only of Israel, but also of Judea. Idolatry increased, adultery increased, and so we read that the ritual of the Sotah, they stopped doing it because too many of the men were committing adultery. They were not going to bring their wives as suspected adulteresses to the temple. And so we're seeing all these statements of the sages about how the spiritual people of the level just decreased and decreased and decreased. Now, this is even at the level of the Mishna. The Mishna was compiled around the year 200 of the Common Era, but many of the rabbis, the sages quoted in the Mishnah, were alive, even during the Second Temple, and then that generation saw the Second Temple destroyed. So this is a traumatized people. Certainly the sages who saw the second temple destroyed by the Romans. And for the next how many years, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, that national trauma still prevailed, right? I mean, their troubles weren't even, they hadn't bottomed out when the temple was destroyed. Some 65 years later, we had the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and that led to 1 million Jews being slaughtered by the Romans. So things are just getting worse and worse and worse. And from the point of view of the sages, how could this be happening? It's our fault, right? It's our fault. I mean, we must have done something to merit so much calamity. And even if you can say, don't blame the victim, even if it's you yourself blaming yourself as the victim, from the sage's point of view, if God had promised the promised land to the people, and God said at that time that you will lose it, if you stray from being a God-fearing and a God-loving people, then you're going to lose your right to the land. And indeed, they watched it happen. So they were interested in saying, well, what were the signs along the way, so that if we ever sort of climb out of this hole and reattain a higher spiritual stature, let's remember what the guideposts are along the way, the markers of spiritual descent, so we can avoid them. And we're continuing that discussion. We picked this up at the bottom of page 47b. The Mishna taught, our Mishnah number 4, here in chapter 9. The Mishnah taught that from the time when Yosei ben Yoezer died, the clusters ceased. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of clusters? In Hebrew, eshkolot. And Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says it means a man who contains all. Ish shehakol bo. Right? Somebody who has everything within him, meaning all the elements of Torah and mitzvahs. Somebody who is both learned and righteous and kind. And the Mishnah further taught that Yochanan the high priest took away the declaration of the tithe. And the Gemara poses a question, what is the reason that he did this? And Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says because they did not give the tithe in the proper manner, as stated by the Torah. And in which way is that? As the merciful one states in the Torah that they should give the first tithe to the Levites, right? We give the actual, the very first thing we tithe is the teruma gedola that's given to the priests. But what's actually called a tithe, meiser, the 10th, that's what's given to the Levites, because the tribe of Levi did not receive land. So the other tribes would give them the tithe, the 10th. So that's what they were supposed to do. And it says, as the merciful one states in the Torah, that they should give it first to the Levites, and we, the Levites, give to the priests, right? The Levites who receive a tithe from the other tribes, they themselves must also tithe. To whom do they tithe? To the priests. And we have a similar teaching today, by the way, that even a person who is supported by the community and lives on the charity of the community should be giving away even 1/10 of his meager income to charity. And in this way, he will build himself up, both spiritually and materially. You never lose money by giving money to charity if you're giving at the regular 10th level, right? You'll make God your partner, whatever your business or job endeavor is, and you never lose by giving 10% to charity. God will increase your pie, as it were, so you can always give that much and more. Now, Ezra penalized the Levites. Right? So what does it mean? They stopped giving to the Levites? Because why? The people became lazy? No, because Ezra, when he led the exiles from the Babylonian exile back into Israel, and this would eventually become the Second Temple period, Ezra penalized the Levites because they didn't come with him from Babylonia to the land of Israel. How did he penalize them? He took away their right to the first tithe. They weren't going to send the first tithe from Israel to the Levites who had remained in Babylonia, and so they were penalized. So consequently, the owner of the produce can no longer recite the declaration of tithes, which includes the statement, I have done according to all that you have commanded me. When they would ascend during the holidays, especially the fall, they would ascend to Jerusalem. And then in older days, they would make this declaration, I have tithed properly. In later years, they couldn't say that anymore because Ezra had canceled the tithe to the Levites. So the Gemara says, okay, well then let the farmer at least declare that he donated the other tithes in the proper manner. And Reish Lakish said, any house that does not state the declaration about the first tithe can no longer state the declaration about any other types of tithes. And the Gemara says, why? And Abaye says, because the written verse began the declaration with the tithe given to the Levite. Quote, and I also gave it to the Levite, and to the stranger, and to the orphan, and to the widow, in accordance with all your mitzvahs that you commanded me. So if he cannot say the first part of the declaration, he cannot say the rest. And the Gemara opposed, that doesn't mean he's exempt from making those other tithes. It's just that he can't declare the tithe when he ascends to Jerusalem. He cannot recite these words. Now the Gemara poses a question. The fact that Rabbi Yochanan canceled the declaration of tithes proves by inference that they would separate tithes in his days, right? So if they are tithing, but they're not allowed to say the words about having tithe, well, at least it shows that they were tithing. But isn't it taught that he, Yochanan the high priest, also canceled the declaration of tithes and decreed with regard to doubtfully tithed produce, known as demai? And why did he issue this decree? Right, so demai, or doubtfully tithed produce, is a decree that came sort of later in Jewish history, while the temples were still standing. But when the level had fallen, previously, everyone in the land was tithing and tithing properly. So if you bought produce from another person, let's say from a farmer or from a merchant, you didn't have to worry about whether that produce had been tithed already or not, because as soon as the produce went from growing in the field and then it was harvested and piles of it were made, so at that time it would be tithed. But later, if tithe was the crops were grown by an am haaretz, somebody who is not that we can't count on him being educated and adhering to Torah law, so you can't assume that he tithed it properly. You don't know whether he tithed it or not, and in the face of that doubt, when you buy it, if you're a pious person, you will tithe it. Now that might result in that produce being tithed twice, but at least it guarantees that you won't eat produce that was never tithed, and that is a serious sin, right? You can only eat produce that has been tithed. And so that's why they made this decree about demai. If it's doubtful whether it was tithed or not, you need to tithe it before you can eat it. That was this decree of Rabbi Yochanan. Where am I? Okay, so why did he issue this decree? Because he sent messengers throughout the land to all the borders of the land of Yisrael to investigate. And he saw that they would separate only teruma gedola, right? The first 2% that goes to the priests. And as for the first tithe, right, the next tithe, the 10% that goes to the Levites, and the second tithe that either the farmer keeps for himself to be spent when he goes on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or in the third and sixth years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, that second tithe was given to the poor. But at any rate, what Yochanan's investigators discovered was that people were strict with respect to teruma gedola, the 2% to the priest, but with respect to the first and second tithe, some people would do it and some people did not do it. So he said to them, my sons, come and I will tell you something, just as the laws of the teruma gedola include a transgression punishable by death at the hand of God. If you don't tithe properly, that's going to shorten your life. As one who ate produce from which teruma has not been separated is punished with death from the hand of heaven. So too, the teruma of the tithe, meaning the portion that the Levites must separate once they receive their tithe. Now they have to tithe from the tithes that they receive. They have to separate their 10% and give that to the priests. So if they don't do that, and this is untithed produce. And any kind of untithed produce is a transgression punishable by death at the hand of God. Now, realizing that it was uncertain with regard to whether or not people were separating those first and second tithes, and whether the Levites were separating their own tithe for the priests, he arose, right? This high priest, Rabbi Yochanan, he arose and instituted an ordinance for them with regard to doubtfully tithed produce, known as demai. One who purchases produce from an am haaretz, from one who is not known to be learned and diligent in the mitzvahs. If he's not known to be that, then he's doubtful, right? And therefore you can't assume that he tithed properly. So since you don't know that the food was tithed, you must tithe it when you purchase it. And you must produce the first and second tithes due to that uncertainty of whether the am haaretz had separated them. And as for the first tithe, meaning what the Levite receives, he then separates teruma of the tithe from it and gives it to the priest. And with regard to the second tithe, he goes up and eats it in Jerusalem in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the cycle. However, with regard to the giving of the first tithe to the Levite and the poor man's tithe, which can be eaten by anyone, as the Levites and the poor only have monetary rights to the produce, the burden of proof rests upon the claimant. Since the Levites and the poor cannot prove that these tithes had not already been set aside by an am haaretz, they cannot force the buyer to give them those tithes, right? So you need to tithe if you purchase something so that it's permissible for you to eat it. But the Levites and the poor can't go around demanding that they be given those tithes, right? They have to wait and just receive it once people tithe, but they can't demand it. Now, in any case, the Gemara proves from the Baraisa that not all people would separate tithes in the era of Yochanan the high priest. So the Gemara answers, so he instituted two ordinances. He canceled the declaration of tithes of those devoted to the meticulous observance of mitzvahs, known as chaverim, especially the laws of teruma and tithes, and he decreed with regard to doubtfully tithed produce purchased from an am haaretz, because they may not have separated at all, right? So in other words, he made a distinction in Israel between people who were certain to have tithed, right? Those are the chaverim, the people who are just very pious and known to be very pious and meticulous in their observance. Those are the chaverim. So that for sure, if you get anything from them, you know it was tithe. You don't have to tithe it. And then there's the am haaretz, right? All the people who are, known to be ignorant, and you can't be sure whether they tithe or not. I don't know if there was an in-between group. It's like either you're part of the chaverim or you're part of the am haaretz, or if those are the extremes and there was some middle group. That I don't know. Now the Mishna further taught Yochanan the high priest also nullified the actions of the awakeners. So the Gemara says, what are the awakeners? And Rachava says, on each and every day when the Levites stood on the platform in the temple, they would recite from Psalms, right? So it's, even today in the prayer book every day, we say, on the first day of the week, the Levites in the temple would recite. And there's the Psalm of Sunday, the Psalm of Monday, the Psalm of Tuesday, etc. But they did more than just recite the daily Psalm. The Levites were the sweet singers of Israel, right? So there was some choir of Levites who would be singing in the temple whenever the temple was standing, the first and second temples. Right, so now it says that Yochanan the high priest nullified the actions of the awakeners, and now the Gemara is telling us who are according to Rachava, what is meant by the awakeners. It's that on each and every day when the Levites stood on the platform in the temple, they would say from Psalm 44, "Awake, why do you sleep, O Lord?" Right? They were praying to God, wake up, save us, rescue us. You must be asleep that you're letting us suffer so much at the hands of our enemies. Therefore, they were called awakeners. And Yochanan the high priest said to them, do you think that the omnipresent is the one who's asleep? and that you are now calling on him to awaken? But isn't it already stated, Psalm 121? Behold, he that keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps, right? The guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. So rather, when the Jewish people are in a state of suffering and the nations of the world are in a state of calm and serenity, it is with regard to this state of affairs that it is stated, awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? If the verse were to be recited every morning, it would be interpreted in the wrong way. And so Yochanan the high priest therefore canceled that daily recitation of this verse. You know, there's a little bit of chutzpah, right? That we're saying, God, why are you asleep? Come and save us. You know, if we're suffering according to this theology, right, it's because we are asleep in our observance of Torah mitzvahs, and that's why those foreign nations had an upper hand on us. So Yochanan said, don't ask God why he's asleep. We should be asking ourselves that. Now, the Mishna also taught that Yochanan the high priest canceled the strikers. And he was not talking about the writer's strike that's currently happening in Hollywood. Who are the strikers? Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says they are those who would scratch the calf being prepared for slaughter as an offering. Right? Cattle that were being prepared as an offering in the temple to be brought as offerings, there would be these people there who would scratch the calf between its horns. What? Why would you do that? And this was to make it easier to slaughter these, because normally when you think about sheep, goats, calves, bulls being slaughtered, okay, this happens in a farm, and or some kind of butchery, whatever they call it, cattle ranch, whatever, like a place where they tend animals, raise animals to become food. And so there's a simple, there's an area of that institution where they slaughter the animals and turn them into steak, right, as it were. Okay, so when they're bringing offerings in the temple, so that's not some kind of a butchery, a tannery, a cattle ranch. This is a place of elevated holiness, the holiest place in the world. So if you're going to have to slaughter animals, and many animals every day that are being brought as offerings, you're going to institute procedures for doing that. And one of them was actually to scratch the calf on its forehead so some blood would spill into its eyes. And that would make the calf very docile. It wouldn't want to move after that. It felt like it was blinded. Rather than lashing out, it would just become very still. And that allowed them to then, make the quick cut and kill the animal as painlessly as possible. So there was somebody who was charged with that job. But Yochanan the high priest ended that practice. Why did he do that? Right, so there were these people called the strikers who would scratch the calf between its horns in order that the blood should fall into its eyes so that the animal would not see or resist being slaughtered. Yochanan came and nullified this practice because it looked like they were causing a blemish in these animals that were being brought as offerings. Now, there was a different explanation of strikers that was taught in a baraisa. And they are those who would beat the calf with sticks to stun it before it was slaughtered in the manner that they do before idols. And Yochanan the high priest said to them, "Until when will you feed unslaughtered animal carcasses to the altar?" And the Gemara says, are these animal carcasses actually unslaughtered animal carcasses? Of course they were slaughtered. They did not die of their own accord. Rather, he said that the beatings could cause them to become like animals with a wound that will cause them to die within 12 months. That's called a treifa. As perhaps these beatings will perforate the membrane surrounding the brain, which would make the calf a treifa, and then they'll be unfit for the altar. So he therefore rose and instituted an ordinance for them to put rings in the ground, right? And so if you look, I'm not going to get it right now, but in the model of the temple, and there's a courtyard where they would actually slaughter the animals, he caused these rings to be installed in the ground, iron rings. So the animal was, brought, tethered to that iron ring, so it wasn't going to go anywhere. And then they would kill it, but they wouldn't have to scratch its forehead or give it a stunning blow to the head, which was unseemly prior to an animal being offered as a sacrifice. And that with sticks, where am I? With the rings. Okay. And now the Mishnah stated that until the days of Yochanan the high priest, the hammer of smiths would strike in Jerusalem during the intermediate days of a festival, right? So if you look at Passover, for example, Passover is celebrated in Israel. So the first day is like Shabbos, right? It's a day of complete rest. You're allowed to cook because it's a festival, unlike Shabbos, but otherwise no work is permitted. The 8th day is a day of complete rest. No work is permitted. But the in-between days, known as Chol HaMoed, with the exception of Shabbos, one can do certain kinds of work. Mostly, we've learned this before, it's work that will prevent you to have a significant financial loss, but it's better not to work on any of the days of the festival. So some people who had that kind of work to do in Jerusalem would, do that work during the intermediate days of the festival, even if it was noisy work, like blacksmiths, right, who needed to hammer some stuff or they would have a serious financial loss. But Yochanan said, despite the serious financial loss, if it's going to create the ruckus of regular work being done, we don't want that during the days of the festival. And so he decreed that there would be no noisy work during festivals in the city of Jerusalem. And it was further taught that in all of his days, a person did not need to inquire with regard to doubtfully tithed produce, demai. And the Gemara notes that this is like that which we stated above, that he instituted an ordinance with regard to the tithing of doubtfully tithed produce. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4. Here's Mishnah number 5 of chapter 9. And we're continuing here in the Mishnah with the list of items that were nullified as the spiritual level of the people sank. From the time when the Sanhedrin ceased, right, when the Sanhedrin didn't meet anymore in the chamber of hewn stones, right, so when the temple was destroyed, that's when the Sanhedrin ceased. Song was also nullified from the places of feasts, i.e., it was no longer permitted to sing at a feast where wine was served. As it is stated, with song they shall not drink wine. And you're like, wait, what? I mean, there's a lot of music being played in the Jewish world. There's a lot of music being played at Jewish events, like weddings, right? And bar mitzvahs, let's say. There's definitely music being played at the party. I mean, certainly at a wedding. So wine is served and music is being played. Are we all committing some kind of a transgression when we do that? Where they said that once the temple was destroyed, there could no longer be music and singing at a feast where wine was also being served. And then in the notes we see there's some limitations on this. Really what they were saying is that this applied to kings who were just always listening to music, and that was considered unseemly. That a Jewish king would be partying. But really what's going on here is that in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple, and that's a tragedy that we never got over, that they did institute certain practices where we would never forget that our joy is always lessened, no matter what's going on in our lives, by the fact that we no longer have the temple in our midst. And this is why we break a glass at a wedding. And while there may be music being played now at weddings, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it may be that, eventually people just started playing music again, but maybe for a long time after the destruction of the Second Temple, they didn't. And there are all kinds of limitations that still exist today. We're not going to get into those technicalities today. But at any rate, the sages in that generation, really said, like, as a people, we need to be in mourning. Like extended mourning, that we as a people sank so low that the temple was removed from our midst because of our sins. From the time when the early prophets died, now that's much earlier, right? That's first temple period. From the time when the early prophets died, the urim v'tumim was nullified. And from the time when the second temple was destroyed, the shemir worm ceased to exist, and also the sweetness of the honeycomb. As the verse says with regard to the laws of the Torah, quote, more to be desired are they than gold, indeed, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Psalm 19. And men of faith cease from being among the Jewish people. As it is stated, help, Lord, for the pious man is finished. For the faithful fail from among the children of men. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that Rabbi Yehoshua testified, from the day the temple was destroyed, there is no day that does not include some form of curse. And since then, the dew has not descended for blessing, and the taste has been removed from fruit. And Rabbi Yosei says, since then, the fat of fruit has also been removed. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, since then, the lost purity has removed the taste and the aroma from fruit. And the tides that were not separated have removed the fat of the grain. And the sages say promiscuity and witchcraft have consumed it all. Now, to some extent, you have to understand, who they're talking to and what they're trying to say. Because they could see, even right after the second temple was destroyed, when everyone felt that national calamity so strong, and a year later, business was still happening. People were still living in Israel. Jews were living in Israel. Synagogues were still having prayer services. The temple was gone. The offerings were gone. The pilgrimages were gone. So much was gone. And the sages were involved in a very long and extended project of rebuilding Judaism based around prayer rather than sacrifices. But what they wanted was that in this, kind of adjusted and evolved Judaism, people would not forget what was lost, because human nature is to just get used to what we are doing. And people forget. The memory of people is so short. Even on our own time, we're seeing my mother was a survivor of a concentration camp. My grandmother carried her through as a baby. The Holocaust was so present in my home growing up. And now, 65 and 85 years after the Holocaust, there's people saying the Holocaust never happened. There's people just don't care. There's people making Holocaust jokes. Kind of anti-Semitism went a little bit underground, a little bit quiet, a little bit, for some time after the Holocaust. And now it's coming out in the open, just Jew haters, proudly talking about and spewing their Jew hatred. And even Jews among the Jew haters, so sadly. So people just get used to the status that they're in, and the sages were trying to say to them, you, it's your personal obligation to understand what was lost when the temple was lost. And if you learn from us, the sages, believe us when we tell you that your world is not what it could be. You might get used to it. You might go numb. You might say, life is fine. It's not so bad. But let me tell you that the fruit that you eat is not as sweet as the fruit that Jews ate in the days that the temple was standing. Everything now is a kind of pale facsimile of what life was like when we had the divine presence in our midst. And since then, the lost purity, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, since then, the lost purity has removed the taste and the aroma from fruit, and the tides that were not separated have removed the fat of the grain, and the sages say promiscuity and witchcraft have consumed it all. The level has sunk so low. That's Mishnah number 5. Here's the Gemara. Now the Gemara poses a question with regard to the first clause of the Mishnah. And from where is it derived that the verse, with song they shall not drink wine, that this is written about the period from the time when the Sanhedrin was nullified? I mean, Isaiah was talking much earlier, right? Much earlier. It was near the end of the first temple period, but the Sanhedrin was not nullified until the end of the second temple period. So how are we to understand that Isaiah was talking about something that would happen, nearly 500 years later? I mean, he was a prophet. He certainly could do that. But how do we know that is what he was talking about? So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said, from that which the verse states, the elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music in Lamentations. And this indicates that the dissolution of the Sanhedrin, who are the elders from the gate, is linked to the end of the young men singing. So if the temple is destroyed, if the Sanhedrin ceases, that's when singing, at least at feasts with wine, has to cease. Now, Rav said, the ear that hears song should be uprooted, as it is prohibited to listen to music after the destruction of the temple. So Rav said, if there is song in a house, there will be destruction on the threshold. As it is stated, voices shall sing in the windows, desolation shall be in the doorposts, for its cedar work shall be uncovered. Now, what you might be seeing here, right, is like there's music all over the religious Jewish world, right? I mean, we've had Shlomo Katz, we've had Eitan Katz, we've had Moshe Storch, we've had Eighth Day, we've had, what are those guys called? Anyway, a lot of from, Jewish singers, religious Jewish singers right here on AT. So how can you say that music is gone? But it's a difference. Right? What are they singing? All, sort of religious Jewish music, it can sound like rock and roll. It can sound like rap. It can sound like punk. It can sound like amazing, incredibly skillful music. But the verses that are sung are always taken from Scripture, right? So it's music of faith. That's permitted. But you will see that among pious people, very pious people, they don't listen to secular music. And it may be because they're fulfilling this, right? I'm not prepared to really talk about the halachas of music and secular music versus music of faith. That's a discussion for another day. But where these restrictions were born, and what the current state of them is a discussion for another day, but where they were born was with the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, the word uncovered, that the ear that hears song should be uprooted. And Rav has said if there is song in a house, its destruction will be on the threshold. As it is stated from Zephaniah 2:14, voices shall sing in the windows, desolation shall be in the doorposts, for its cedar work shall be uncovered. And the word uncovered could be read to mean its city, era versus era. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of, for its cedar work shall be its city? And furthermore, Rabbi Yitzchak wondered when he said, is a house interlaced with cedars not as strong as a city, and therefore not threatened by desolation? Rather, it means that even a house interlaced with cedars will become unstable if song is heard there. And Rav Ashi said, learn from it that when the destruction starts, it starts with the threshold. As it is stated, desolation shall be in the posts. And if you wish, say instead that they derive the idea from here, in the city is left desolation, and the gate is smitten unto ruin. And Mar bar Rav Ashi said, I saw it, this She'iyah, which is a destructive demon, and that it strikes the gate first. And it was goring and wreaking havoc like an ox. And Rav Huna said, the song of those who pull ships and lead the herd is permitted. Oh, so this kind of singing is permitted. Why? For their singing assists them to establish a rhythm in their work. However, the song of weavers is forbidden, as they sing only for their own enjoyment. And the Gemara relates that subsequently Rav Huna nullified all types of song, and this led to a general blessing. And the price of 100 ducks stood at a dinar, and 100 seah of wheat at a dinar, and there was no desire for them even at such a cheap price due to their great abundance. Meaning, when there was a generation that took this prohibition on singing, frivolous singing, as opposed to, ritual or singing for the sake of God, but just frivolous singing, secular singing, when they took that prohibition seriously, the nation's level went up again, and God sort of rewarded them with material prosperity in the farms. Rav Yosef said, if men sing and women respond, right, this is very bad, right, men and women singing together, this is licentiousness. So if women sing and men respond, it causes the evil inclination to burn as if one were setting fire to the chips of kindling. And the Gemara poses a question: what difference is there? Rav Yosef indicates that in any case, both are prohibited, and the Gemara answers to nullify one before the other, i.e. if it is possible to ban singing entirely, if it is impossible to ban singing entirely, they should at least stop the most problematic form. Rabbi Yochanan says anyone who drinks wine with the accompaniment of 4 types of instruments brings 5 types of retribution to the world. As it is stated, woe to them who rise early in the morning, that they may follow strong drink, who tarry late into the night until wine inflames them. And the harp and the psaltery, the drum and the pipe and the wine are at their feasts, but they do not regard the work of the Lord. So this idea that sex, drugs, and rock and roll is the road to hell. Why? Because it turns the mind away from a life of righteousness and piety and toward hedonism. After listing the sin of those who drink wine with musical accompaniment, the verse states their punishment. What is written afterward? Therefore, my people have gone into captivity for want of knowledge. From Isaiah, meaning that they cause exile to the world. And their honorable men are famished, meaning as they bring famine to the world, and their multitude are parched with thirst. This is all from Isaiah 5:13. And this means that they cause the Torah, which is compared to water, to be forgotten by those who learn it. And mankind is bowed down, and man is humbled. That they cause the enemy of the Holy One, blessed be He, i.e. God Himself, to be brought down as man. In the phrase, and man is humbled, means nothing other than the Holy One, blessed be He. As it is stated, the Lord is a man of war. That's from the song at the sea. So they're making like a connection to a connection to a connection here. Obviously, God is not a man, but He's sometimes metaphorically described as a man of war, like a being of war. Meaning that when the children of Israel are fighting an obligatory war, God makes sure that they succeed. It's like the Holy One, blessed be He, is gonna, is part of the army, as it were. God is not a man, is not part of an army. He just dictates what He wants to happen in the world, and it happens. But these people who engage in frivolous music and drinking and bring others into their hedonistic camp, cause God's respect. The people who respect God in the world, they are diminished, right? There's fewer and fewer pious people in the world. That insults God, that disappoints God. It's a terrible process that is happening here. And that process leads to the Jewish people being brought down. And what punishment is written afterward for the people who drank wine with musical accompaniment? Therefore, the netherworld has enlarged her desire and opened her mouth without measure, and down goes their glory and their tumult and their uproar, and he who rejoices among them. Right? So all these frivolous drinking partiers who cause others to join them, all of them end up, in Gehenna. Are they going to Gehenna forever? Probably not. Are they going to spend more time in Gehenna than they would have otherwise? Yes. Now, we're on 48b. The Mishna taught, from the time when the early prophets died, the urim v'tumim was nullified. And the Gemara poses a question, who are the early prophets? And Rav Huna says this is referring to David and Samuel and Solomon. And after their death, the urim v'tumim was no longer used. Now, what is the urim v'tumim? So it's never clearly described what it was. We don't know exactly what it was, but we understand that when there was a high priest in Israel, right, so from the time of Aaron in the wilderness, who was the first high priest, Kohen Gadol, through all the years that sacrifices were brought at the tabernacle, both in the wilderness and for the first 400 years that the children of Israel occupied Israel, and the 400 years of the first temple. And later, but now we're saying, well, maybe not in the second temple period, but as long as there was a high priest, and up until this ended, the high priest had some kind of a communication system embedded in his breastplate, which they could ask questions to God, right? It was literally a hotline to heaven. Now, they couldn't ask any questions. There would only be questions of national importance, like is going to war against the Philistines, is that an obligatory war? And they could get an answer on the hotline to heaven, right? It was like these stones on the breastplate would light up in a certain way. We don't know exactly how it worked, but it was revealed to the high priest, in those days when the spiritual level of the people was higher, how to ask and how to interpret the answer that would come through the Urim Vitumim, this hotline to heaven, as it were. Right. So after the days of David, so according to this, from the days of David, Samuel, and Solomon, the Urim Vitumim no longer worked. After Solomon died, already the people sank so low that the nation split into two kingdoms. The Urim Vitumim doesn't work anymore. And Rav Nachman said, in the days of David, there were times when an answer rose up from them from the Urim Vitumim, and there were times when the answer did not rise up. It was already getting a little bit glitchy. The Urim Vitumim was already glitchy because the level of the people had already sunk. They were at war with the Philistines after all and had a long, hard war, right? That they couldn't win until David came along. And the proof for this is that Zadok, the high priest in David's time, asked the Urim Vitumim, and an answer rose up for him. But when Abiathar asked, an answer did not rise up for him. As it is stated, and Abiathar went up, 2 Samuel 15:24, and he was removed from serving as the high priest as a result, because he didn't get that answer. Something was wrong. And Rav Bar Shmuel raises an objection. The verse states concerning Uzziah, and he set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who had an understanding of the vision of God. 2 Chronicles 26. So what? Is the verse not stating that Uzziah would seek God by asking questions of the Urim Vitumim, despite the fact that he lived after the time of Solomon? And the Gemara rejects this claim. No. He would seek God by asking questions of the prophets, but not from the Urim Vitumim. And the Gemara suggests, coming here a proof from a Baraisa with regard to when the Urim Vitumim ceased, from the time that the first temple was destroyed. The cities with fields that were allocated to the Levites were nullified, and the Urim Vitumim ceased, and monarchy ceased from the house of David. And if a person would whisper to you saying that the Urim Vitumim is still existing, as it states with regard to when the second temple first stood, Ezra 263, it says, and the Tirshasa said to them that they should not eat of the most sacred things until there stood a priest with the Urim Vitumim, which seems to indicate that they merely had to wait until the second temple was completed for the reappearance of the Urim Vitumim. So maybe there was Urim Vitumim in the second temple. But if someone says that to you, you should say to him, no, this is not referring to an expectation of a short-term development, but it is like a person who says to his friend with regard to something that will occur in the distant future, yeah, that'll happen when the dead are resurrected and the Messiah, the son of David, returns or comes to us, right? In other words, when the line of David is restored and Mashiach comes, that's when such a thing will happen. And that is, when somebody was talking about the Urim Vitumim is when it's back, then we can do such and such or know such and such. He wasn't speaking about something that was going to happen in the next year or 2 or 10. He was talking about something in the far off future. Yeah, when the Mashiach comes, right? When Mashiach comes, Mashiach ben David, the world will be as filled with knowledge of God as water fills the sea. And there will be a third temple. Will the Urim Vitumim be in it? I don't know. Maybe we won't need it because the whole world will be a hotline to heaven, so to speak. Now, rather, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, who are the early prophets with respect to this teaching that once they died, the Urim Vitumim went out of existence or stopped working? So according to this interpretation of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, it wasn't David, Samuel, and Solomon, but rather Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who are actually the latter prophets. And the Urim Vitumim was used throughout the first temple period, up to but not including the time of these late prophets. As the sages taught in a Baraisa, from the time when Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi died, the divine spirit departed from the Jewish people, as these three were considered to be the last prophets. And even after the Urim Vitumim ceased to exist, they would nevertheless still make use of a divine voice to receive instructions from above, even after this time, right? We see even after the second temple was destroyed, there were times when a bas kol would speak, a divine voice could be heard. but there weren't prophets who were prophesying, and there was no way, to dial the hotline to heaven, as it were. We can talk to God anytime we want. That we call that prayer and talking to God, and it's an important practice. But usually we don't get an answer in the form of a divine voice. Now, back then, on one occasion, the sages were reclining in the upper story of the house of Guri in Jericho, and a divine voice came from heaven and said to them, "There is one person among you for whom it is fitting that the divine presence should rest upon him as a prophet, but this generation is not fit for it." In other words, they heard a divine voice say that if there were still prophets in Israel, then there's one among you who would be a prophet. And who was that? Hillel, the great sage Hillel. They heard a divine voice say that if there were prophets in this generation, he would be your prophet. But there aren't prophets. And again, on another occasion, in the upper story of a house in Yavne, this divine voice from heaven, the Bas Kol, came to them and said, "There is a person among you whom it is fitting that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, should rest upon him, but this generation is not fit for it." And who was that? Shmuel Hakatan. And when he died, they eulogized him in the following manner: "Alas, humble one, alas, pious one, student of Hillel." Just as Hillel was called when he was died a student of Ezra, which you go back to like the time that prophets ended. And he too, Shmuel Hakatan, said the following statement of divinely inspired prediction at the time of his death. Shimon, and he was talking about Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and Yishmael, meaning Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, who was the high priest, they are slated for the sword, and their colleagues for killing, and the rest of the people for plunder, and great troubles are destined to befall the people. It's as if he was prophesying because he could see how bad things were going. He wasn't a prophet, but his words all came true. And they also sought to say about Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, while eulogizing him, "Alas, pious one, alas, humble one," but the moment was disturbed and they could not do so. And that is because eulogies are not given for those killed by the monarchy, which was Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba's fate, in order not to arouse the monarchy's wrath, right? They wouldn't have a general population-wide bewailing of the loss of a great leader if that great leader was killed by the Roman authority, because that would lead to a pogrom, right? So they couldn't eulogize such a person. The Mishnah taught from the time when the first temple was destroyed, the shemir ceased to exist. This was a small worm that we learn elsewhere was used to cut the stones of Solomon's temple. Why? Because there's a tradition that says when Solomon built the temple, you never heard hammer and chisel breaking stone on the Temple Mount. How is that possible? How did they cut these massive stones? There was this little worm that would very slowly but carefully break the stones for them. Or, the sages taught the shemir is a creature with which Solomon built the temple. As it is stated, for the house, when it was built of whole stone from the quarry. Now, these words should be understood exactly as they are written, that King Solomon took whole stones and shaped them by having the shemir worm do the cutting. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Nehemiah said to him, "And is it possible to say this? But isn't it already stated, all these were costly stones according to the measures of hewn stones, sawed with saws." 2 Kings 7:9, which indicates that saws, which are iron implements, were used to shape the stones. So if so, what is the meaning when the verse states, "And hammer, axe, and any tool of iron were not heard in the house when it was being built," about Solomon's temple? So it means that he would prepare the stones outside the Temple Mount using tools and then bring them inside already cut so that no iron tools were used inside the temple itself. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said the statement of Rabbi Yehuda that no iron tools were used appears to be correct with regard to the temple stones, and the statement of Rabbi Nehemiah that tools were used appears to be correct with regard to the stones of the king's own house. Now the Gemara poses a question, and according to Rabbi Nehemiah, who maintains that they used iron tools even in the cutting of the stones of the temple, for what purpose did the shemir come? And the Gemara answers, it was necessary for that which is taught in a Baraisa. These stones in the breastplate and the ephod, which were inscribed with the names of the tribes, they may not be written on with ink, because it is stated like the engravings of a signet, which means the names must be engraved onto the stones. and they may not be scratched with a scalpel, because it is stated in their full settings, indicating that the stones must be complete and not missing any of their mass. Rather, and then I'm going to have to just skip a little bit because it's so late, but they use the shemir worm to cut the stones, the little stones, the gemstones that were on the breastplate of the ephod of the high priest. Rabbi Ami says, from the time when the first temple was destroyed, shiny silk and white glass ceased to exist, which they didn't. Obviously, there was high quality silk even after the temple was destroyed, and there was white glass, means clear glass, that these things, of course, they continue to exist. What does it mean? They're describing a golden age where everything had a greater luster, right? Where the silk was shinier, where the glass was more brilliant, and the sweetness of the honeycomb ceased, right? Obviously, honeycomb is still sweet, but not as sweet as it was in those days. Fine flour floats up and remains on top of the sieve, right? Like the flour was finer then. The bread was tastier. Everything was better. I mean, what's funny about this is, who are they just waxing nostalgic? Is this all just metaphoric? No. When the divine presence rested in Israel, there was just a brilliance to life that was lost later. And we can maybe understand this a little bit better even than our ancestors did in the 2,000 years since, because we live in a time when there's all this genetically modified food that is tasteless, right? Like you've had a farmer's market tomato that's like really sweet and juicy and flavorful, and it's not perfectly red and round, but it has great taste. But the tomatoes that you eat in the supermarket, which, were modified so that they look big and round and red and stay fresh on the supermarket shelf longer so they can make more money, but it's flavorless, right? I'm sure you've all experienced that. And so, I'm just saying this as a metaphor that we can understand a little bit how in an earlier time, everything could have had more taste, more sparkle, more brilliance. Okay. And the Mishna states that from the time when the second temple, I'm just skipping a couple paragraphs so I can take a couple questions on the hour. And the Mishna states that from the time when the second temple was destroyed, men of faith ceased. And Rabbi Yitzchak says these are people who believe in the Holy One, blessed be He, and place their trust in Him in all their ways. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Eliezer the Great says that whoever has bread in his basket to eat today, but asks, what shall I eat tomorrow? Meaning he does not know how he will acquire bread for tomorrow. This is a person who lacks faith. And so, and since the temple was destroyed, everyone is a little bit fearful. Everyone is a little bit suspicious. Everyone is a little bit paranoid. With reason, right? Once that spiritual level of the people fell, the first temple was destroyed. Eventually, the second temple was destroyed. And the Jews, have suffered persecution. In every generation, they rise up to destroy us, right? There's always this gnawing fear. Right? And it's very hard to be a person of perfect faith and say, whatever God wills is good. We got to keep saying that, and we have to say it so much and so often that we come to believe it. But before that first temple was destroyed, and certainly before the second temple was destroyed, there were people who really lived in that space of full faith. And the sages are saying no one has that level of faith anymore. And this is what Rabbi Lazar said. What is the meaning of that which is written in Zechariah 4:10? For who plunders the day of small things? What caused the table of the righteous to be plundered in the future? It was the small-mindedness that they possessed. And what is this small-mindedness? They did not believe in the Holy One, blessed be He, with a complete faith. And Rava said, who plunders the day of small things? These are the small children of the wicked ones, of the Jewish people who die young. Meaning this lack of, when you talk about the enemies of the Jewish people, that's always a euphemism in the Talmud, like the phrase, the enemies of the Jewish people, for the Jewish people themselves. In other words, we've brought ourselves low. They're giving that message over and over and over again, and it causes tremendous suffering amongst us. I'm very close to done. Questions or comments, get them in. And when God sits in judgment of the parents, right, when children die because of the sins of their parents, the children say before God, Master of the universe, because you were destined to exact punishment from our fathers in the world to come for their wickedness, Why did you blunt their teeth with the death of their children in their lifetimes? If you're going to punish our fathers for their sins, right, when they leave this world and they go to Gehenna, and then they're going to suffer punishment for their sins, why do you visit that punishment on the children? And in this way, why did you blunt their teeth with the death of their children in their lifetimes? And I guess the Gemara answers, in this way, the death of their children atones for the fathers, right? I mean, an adult, there's no greater suffering than the loss of a child. And, because we experienced so much, so many pogroms, genocides, Holocaust, persecutions, in which we saw our children killed, it's like all this suffering through Jewish history, some would say it's like we've suffered enough. We've paid for these terrible sins of our ancestors, and the time has come, right? The time has come for Mashiach. Now, they were already saying this, 1,500 years ago, but if you listen to Rabbi Wolf and so many others teaching today, Rabbi Mizrahi, I think, Rabbi Reuben, that Nina listens to, it's like we're getting very close. There's been so much suffering for so long. The world is so topsy-turvy right now. Up is down, white is black, black is white, red is blue, blue is red. Everything is so crazy, so much falsehood being propagated in the world. Some would say that is a sign that we're very close to the Messianic age. May it be so. Okay, a few questions and comments on Sotah, page 48. Elvis, the Levites cared for us spiritually, so we cared for them physically, discussing the tithing that we talked about at the top of the hour. Once again, mutualism and symmetry in our society. Good, Elvis. Bell, I understand that part of the ongoing fight, no other word, between kosher or halal slaughter and European authorities goes between the EU, who wants the animals... Oh, I see. That Bell is talking about, when we talk about how Yochanan, the high priest, sort of stopped them doing, it was different, right? But he was saying that the normal slaughter practices in the temple that had existed in the early days, he stopped them because it looked like blemishes were being caused for the animals, even though they weren't. Now, in the early days, that didn't matter because everyone knew that no blemished animals were ever brought to the altar. But as the spiritual level generally was falling, he had to say, not only are we going to avoid impropriety, but even the appearance of impropriety. Bell is picking up on that and saying that you now see in Europe legal authorities saying that, well, we don't want kosher slaughter, and I guess halal slaughter also, though that's a subject I know nothing about, but let's say no kosher slaughter. There are European countries that want to ban kosher slaughter because they would say that it is kinder to the animal, I guess, to put the electric prod on its head and knock it and kill it quickly with that, rather than the very, very sharp blade that makes a very quick cut. I witnessed a kosher slaughter. I don't think that young sheep that I saw, that lamb, suffered a great deal. It's very quick. I mean, the cut is instant, and then the blood goes out, and it's like the lamb just sort of drops and falls asleep. I mean, it's very quickly as the blood drains out. I mean, you can bleed out very quickly. And that's the way we're commanded to do it, So these authorities, these so-called authorities, that are going to protect these animals, I can't say that those governments, they should clean up their own house before they tell us how we should change a 3,000-year-old law. Moving on. Bill, I know this is the sages underlining how tragic the loss of the temple is, but it's reminding me of a joke at my own tradition's expense. How many Episcopalians does it take to change a light bulb? 3. One to call the electrician, one to mix the drinks, and one to sadly say, I miss the old light. Okay. That's not so different from Jewish jokes, I gotta say. But thank you. I've never heard an Episcopalian joke before. Thank you, Bill. That's what I've got for us today. And tomorrow is the final page 49 of Tractate Sotah. So it will be at our regular Friday time, noon Pacific. bring a little drink and a little cake to make a l'chaim and a bracha as we celebrate the completion of our journey through this tractate. And it's another long daf, and plus the siyum, celebration. So, okay, tomorrow's class is going to be a little bit more than an hour. Not a lot, but just a little bit more. That's what I've got. All the best. Good night.